Welcome to Publications, a webinar series hosted by the Candler Foundry at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. The Candler Foundry is designed to bring opportunities for rich theological learning beyond the walls of the seminary, making them accessible and engaging for everyone. In that spirit, this webinar series features discussions of newly published academic works and invites the broader public into the important conversations that these books engage. My name is Elizabeth Arnold, also known as EB, and I'm the postdoctoral fellow and New Testament teacher for the Candler Foundry. I have the pleasure of being your Foundry host and conversation moderator today. Today we're discussing Susan Hylen's book, Finding Phoebe, What New Testament Women Were Really Like. This book explores literary and material evidence of how women really lived in New Testament times and examines what virtues women were praised for in regard to the actions they took, both in common and extraordinary circumstances. With us today are the author, Susan Hylen, and three distinguished panelists, Reverend Dr. Jaime Clark Soles, Dr. Nijay Gupta, and Reverend Elizabeth Rogers. We'll first hear from Dr. Hylen a bit about the book in general, and then we'll have a roundtable conversation with these four. Not necessarily formal academic responses, more like being in the living room with the author and her three friends. At any point, you, the audience, can put through questions or comments using the chat feature. Our team will collect and curate these, and we'll pose the questions to the panel as they relate to the conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Susan Hylen. She's the Almer H. Shatford Professor of New Testament at Emory's University Candler School of Theology. She authored Finding Phoebe, as well as several books before, on women in New Testament times and theology, including Women in the New Testament and A Modest Apostle, Thecla and the History of Women in the Early Church. I should also mention that Susan was my own teacher for Greco-Roman backgrounds, and so I am very grateful for her scholarship on a very personal level. Welcome, Susan, and thank you so much for being here. Could you tell us a little bit of the backstory of your book, and how did you find your way to Finding Phoebe?
Yeah, thank you, Evie. It's really nice to be here as well, and I'm really glad that you're the host. I wrote Finding Phoebe in large part because of my amazing Candler students. Candler students are so talented and so faithful, and as I get to know them well, I often hear some about the struggles that go on behind the scenes. So, for example, a student who was called by God to come to seminary, and yet her church at home wants to support her, but they don't really think that women should ever go to seminary, and the kinds of struggles that creates for students. Or maybe another male student who is really supportive of women in ministry, but he's trying to figure out, how do I explain this to the church that I'm leading? Because they don't share any of these same assumptions that I do. And so I wrote this book in part because of those students, but also my hope is that it goes beyond the classroom and actually into those church settings that those students have in mind, so that that female student, her church might be able to read this book, not just hear about it from her, and it might lead them into an exploration about these questions that are so important to a lot of people. I hope that the effect of the book might be the same as the effect that I hope in a lot of my classes, which is to give students tools so that they can interpret the Bible for themselves. I don't want to tell them what it means. I want them to be able to engage and figure it out themselves. And I know that they'll find things that I didn't see there. So in this particular case, of course, I'm thinking about interpreting texts that are about women or apply to women in some way. And I have a couple of particular tools in mind that I'll mention. The first one, which is probably really obvious, is historical information. So we often want to read the Bible faithfully as a product of its historical context. And yet it turns out we have all of this terrible information. We've been misinformed about what women's lives were really like in the New Testament period. For example, I have tended to think myself that women couldn't own property, for example, or that they essentially were property of first their fathers and then of their husbands, that they didn't have any independence apart from men. And I discovered that none of these things are really true in the first century. And that changes the way that I think about the New Testament and even the things that I see there. as I'm reading passages that were familiar to me before. So I hope that will be a tool for readers of the book. And the second tool I'll mention is that I want to help people understand how or why we see these conflicting signals that the New Testament language sends to us. So, for example, 1 Timothy 2 famously says that women should be silent. And yet, as we all know, there are women speaking throughout the Bible, and often it's really important speech. So, for example, Luke portrays Anna as a prophet in the temple in Luke 2, and she speaks about the importance of Jesus and identifies him as the Messiah. Or Mary Magdalene, right, proclaims the Easter message, I have seen the Lord. And without the gospel, without her proclamation, where would we be? So readers of the Bible are already noticing those apparent contradictions, or at least they seem like contradictions to us. And we're trying to figure out what to do with them, right? And you probably have a way that you do that yourself. And the book is trying to offer a new way, which is to simply acknowledge that cultures are really complex. And there's not a single force, right? A single value or standard that shapes our cultural interactions. Ancient cultures had ideas that men were superior to women, for sure, but that wasn't the only thing that they cared about. So, for example, one other thing that they cared about a lot was social status. And some women were wealthy and fabulous and had higher class standing than men around them. And in those cases, they had a lot of authority or influence, or might be called upon to speak. So I think that when we think about that complexity of culture, it can help us to make decisions ourselves about what we see in the Bible and the ways that that maybe everything wasn't as neat and seamless as we might expect it to be. So I hope that's a good introduction to the book, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Susan. That is a wonderful introduction to this book. And I particularly love how you show us the connection between how women and people in general were living 2,000 years ago, and that it's very much the same world, even with all of its differences, that people are still trying to navigate all of these different social expectations, cultural expectations. And when we look at the New Testament, expectations of faith and how to be faithful believers and faithful fellow Christians. So thank you so very, very much. I am absolutely thrilled to be here and get to listen in on this conversation. So right now I'll introduce our panelists, and these are also people who have interacted with this topic of women in the New Testament on their own. And so first we have Reverend Dr. Jaime Clark Soles. She's a professor of New Testament and the Altshuler Distinguished Teaching Professor at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. She's also the director of the Baptist House of Studies at Perkins, and her books include Women in the Bible, which Susan Hylen served as the editor for. And Dr. Clark Soles is also the New Testament editor of the Common English Bible, Women's Bible. Dr. Nijay Gupta serves as professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary. His publications include Paul and the Language of Faith, A Beginner's Guide to New Testament Studies, and Tell Her Story, How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church. Dr. Gupta is also co-editor of the second edition of the Dictionary of Paul and His Letters and senior translator for Pauline Letters for the New Living Translation. And last but not least, we have Reverend Elizabeth Rogers, who currently serves as the Connections Pastor at Classic City Church, a non-denominational church in Athens, Georgia. She is a Candler alumna from 2018 with a Master of Divinity, and she had a concentration in Scripture and Interpretation. And Elizabeth credits her current ministry position at Classic City Church in large part to the impact of Dr. Hylen's Early Christian Women course that she took during her final year at Candler. So I am delighted to have you all here. Thank you so much for being here. As we get started, I would just love to have you all weigh in on what was the one takeaway that you were so grateful to have uncovered in this book, or the aha moment that you had. And might I say, not only in reference to the content, but also what the format of this book, and as Susan just described, what it was intended to do. So I would love to hear from you. Who wants to go first? All right, Dr. Gupta.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Susan, again for this book. Such a delight. I think one of the great benefits of the book is that it's short. There's an ancient writer that says a big book is a big evil, and I love short books because they're easy for us to recommend to students, to people in the church, and it's easy to read. It has a title that really grabs you. What I really love about the format of this book, I'm kind of stealing all of these things from the other speakers, but I love the see for yourself format, right? I love that you're asking in the book for people to notice things, write down lists, because that leads the reader to a process of discovery. That's all I'm going to say about the format, because I'll let other people chime in. But one thing that I learned, I know Jamie pretty well, and we traverse this world. But sometimes we'll kind of learn new things or things we haven't thought about before. One thing was the widow's mite owning her own money. And I'd never really thought of that. I had thought about, the parable of the lost coin. This woman, I love to tell my students about the parable of the lost coin. The two things to know about this woman are she has her own money and she knows how to throw a party. Like that's the two. But the widow's mite, I thought that was really interesting. It just shows you, even on a broad economic scale, that women can have their own money and use it for great good. So that's all I'll say, just to get the conversation going.
All right, Dr. Clark Soles.
Let me jump in there because I want to piggyback on what Nijay said. And yes, again, thank you, Susan. This is fantastic. I love, in terms of the format, I love that it's a workbook. And I really love the emphasis and the number of times. If you did a concordance search on your book, you would find the word imagine or imagination quite a lot. And I also love, by the way, that exercise where you ask people to list verbs. That's just so brilliant, right? It's different from saying women, blah, blah. You're having like, this is active. Look at these verbs. So I second everything Nijay said, and I absolutely love the format. But I want to piggyback on his comment about the widow's mite in terms of an aha moment, or if there one thing readers could get out of this book that I would absolutely love, it is that the situation is not an either or. It is typically a both and. Right? Not either or, but a both and. So just quickly, I'll give you an example. I was teaching not too long ago. We were doing Luke 8, which you bring up more than once, Luke 8, 1-3, about the women's supporting out of their own resources, supporting Jesus. And I was teaching this, and someone raised their hand, and this is a great question. I'm not derogating this question. It's a great question and shows the assumption. And they wanted to understand, how could women, they assumed they were all prostitutes. So they made the link that if someone since most women in the Bible seem to be prostitutes, and these women have money, they were really confused because they were like, wouldn't the men, basically pimps or whatever, how could they have money if they were also prostitutes? So I think maybe that was because Mary's mixed in there and people think she's a prostitute. A lot of things get conflated, in other words. So what I love, especially if they could just take away everything you've said about Luke 8, 1-3, I think they could extrapolate to other passages. So thank you for that concrete example that you bring up more than once from different angles.
Reverend Rogers.
Yeah, I'll definitely bring up the rear here because I'm just your regular old lady pastor. I'm honored to be in the company of these brilliant minds. But Dr. Hylen, I've told her countless times, she's one of my theological heroes. I just followed her as much as I could at Candler and learned as much as I could from her during my time there. And this book, I found myself cheering aloud the entire time I read it because it is so practical, and she has distilled so much of her abundant wisdom into this very accessible book. And I just couldn't wait to get it into the hands of a lot of people that I know and love, whether they've thought about this topic before or they think they're very decided on their view of it. I'm so excited to introduce it to people in my context in different ways, because my church is non-denominational, which means we are a big mix of people with all walks of life and all viewpoints. And I think that's beautiful, because such is the kingdom of God. We are all a big mix of people with lots of different ideas. And it's how do we seek Jesus and love others and find unity in that way. And I think this book is so wonderful at helping us do this on this really important topic. It really does, as they have said with the format, each chapter makes you get your hands dirty. It has you flipping through scripture. It has you getting out a pen and a highlighter and writing down the things that she's presented to you, like, Dr. Hylen said in the introduction, to interpret it for yourself. She doesn't put it out there on a platter. She presents the facts and what scripture says and says, now, what do you do with this? And it is really encouraging. And I love how she builds through the historical evidence and scripture to end with the topic that most people really wrestle with, speech and silence for women, both in the early church and in the church today. So just really loved it and look forward to sharing it with as many people as I can, honestly.
Thank you so much, you guys. You are all three amazing. And you do so much work in this area on your own, but it's just such an honor for me to have you here. But thank you so much.
So, of course, Dr. Gupta said, one of the book's benefits is that it's short. It's easy to read. You go through it quickly. So, of course, there have to be things that you couldn't say or you didn't have the room or space to say. So the next question for our panelists is, what was something that you would like to hear more about, or a question that this reading brought up for you that you would love to, now that you have Susan here, that you'd love to ask her or tease out more?
Well, I'll jump in. I don't want to share the different order. So I have a whole list. I have top 3. So let me pick. This is hard. Can I ask 2? One, you reference in the book something I think is really important to highlight for all readers is we have new evidence. We get new evidence about historical things. And I think that's really important. I think a lot of readers think we have all the evidence we ever had. It's a done deal. It's a static situation. So my first question, let me just stick with this first one, although my other ones I really want to know, but I can ask you offline. Where do you find this new evidence? Can you explain to the general population, how is it that we could come across new evidence of antiquity? Where do you find this stuff that helps you change your argument?
Yeah, thank you, Jaime. That's a great question. There are still archaeologists out there in the field doing all kinds of work, and they are often publishing new inscriptions or other kinds of, things that they dig up out of the ground, right? And some of these are maybe ones that have been published before, but people just didn't pay attention to them, right? That wasn't translated into English, perhaps, or something like that. So it didn't really come into our imaginations. So it is sort of an ongoing process, historical discovery. And even as we speak, historians and archaeologists are engaging in this work. So the idea that we might find new things is exciting. And I don't think they're going to be things that are just going to, blow our minds and change everything. But it matters to have, more information out there. And I certainly think that the number of women scholars who've been interested in this topic and doing this work has made a big difference too, right? Because they've been searching through all of the various things that people find for what's important, what gives us insight into the lives of women. And so that scholarship is really valuable to me as well.
Great.
I'll jump in real quick. So many questions, and I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit. I don't know if that's okay, but I think other listeners may be interested. I want to go back to Luke chapter 8. I did have a question about it. So you have these women that are, who have been healed or have demons cast out by Jesus, and they're following him, and they must have some wealth because it says they're providing for his ministry from their means. You're going to have to do some speculation here, but they don't just have stacks of cash under their mattress. Whatever they have to liquidate. Can you give us some sense, just even use your imagination of, are they selling jewelry? Are they cashing out at the bank? How is this happening, right? This is the ancient world where you just don't have cash sitting around. So can you give us just a little bit of what these women are actually doing to be able to provide funds for the ministry?
Yeah. Wow, that's such a great question. I love you're asking me to imagine that because it's not something that I've thought of before. But obviously, because historical imagination is important also. It brings to mind the woman who anoints Jesus, right? She has this incredibly valuable jar of ointment and she cracks it open and anoints Jesus to let everyone know who he is. And I think that sense that women had property, sometimes valuable property, but that was sort of easily bought and sold, could be something that is behind the funding that these women are doing. It's not just that women are inviting Jesus and his disciples over to their houses and hosting him. And you can imagine how that, would be one way that works. Women are doing that for sure. But the women in Luke 8 are mentioned as traveling with Jesus and supporting the group. And so then they're not at home, right? So I think it's a really great question that you ask about, like, what are the sources of that money? There certainly is cash money, right? And people have that, but they also had jewelry and other valuable items that might be sold in order to, then travel and buy food or a place to stay in another place. I like thinking about that. The one of the women is the wife of Herod's steward, Chusa, right? And he might have had quite a bit of wealth. Certainly being connected to Herod would give you a lot of, access to power. And she's connected to him, right? So we see the ways that women's social status varied a lot based on their connections to other people. So I often wonder about him, or about her in particular, but like, was she really wealthy? How wealthy was she? What sort of money did she have? And where does it come from? And it's hard to know for sure, but some women probably owned property and, raised crops and that sort of thing, or had a business where they sold bricks or something of that nature. And then that money might be funneled in part into the Jesus movement.
Go ahead, Reverend Rogers.
So for me, I've already loved learning about this in your courses, but I really appreciated how you articulated it in the book about the speech and silence chapter, and how you went through the word studies in the Greek, and how the same word that talks about women remaining silent or quiet were the same words that were also used towards men in the scriptures. I just wondered, for those joining us, if you could expound on that just so they could hear it from you, because I found it fascinating. You did such a great job of explaining that.
Thanks. It's a great point. I mean, I remember discovering this myself and thinking, how interesting that silence was also a virtue for men. It's not what I was, prepared to understand was the case, but for ancient people, really anybody who was in the presence of someone who was of higher social status than them should defer to them in speech, right? Let the important person speak and be quiet yourself. And the ancient people also understood that this is hard, right? For a lot of us, we want to talk. We want to be like, oh yeah, me, I've got an idea, I know. And so it can be hard to stop talking when you're supposed to and let someone else do that, and to acknowledge that you were a person of lower status. To the ancient people, that was a virtue, right? That you would see read the social cues appropriately and respond in the way that was correct. That was important to them. And so the idea that men are also doing this, the same thing that women are doing, saying, should I speak now? Is it appropriate for me? I find that really important too. So thank you for mentioning that.
Susan, did you come away with any new questions yourself, like that you want to pursue, like in writing about more, or something that you found really fascinating that you would like to kind of pull that thread a little bit?
Oh yeah, what a great question. I have too many to mention in the time that we have, but what I will say is that related to the research I'm doing now is I ended up with a lot of questions about gender as a category in the ancient world and the way that we talk about it. So for example, we've often said men were the opposite of women then, and they understood themselves as like, if you're being a man, you're not being a woman, kind of a thing. And there's definitely some signals about that. But when we see women acting in all of these ways that men also acted, it starts me questioning not just about how we should describe women, but also how we should describe men. Like, was it the case that men were simply the opposite of women, or what else is going on there? So I'm interested now in other questions too, like describing ancient masculinity as well.
Oh, wow. That's really, really interesting. Well, we'll be waiting for that book to come out very, very soon. Another question for the panelists. Whose bookshelf would you really love to see this book on? And it doesn't just have to be an individual, maybe a group or a church or an organization. Who would you love to put this book in their hands and see them really interact with it? And anybody can answer. You don't have to go in any particular order.
Well, I'm in it when I said earlier, as many people as possible. When I was sharing the news about this discussion today, I put the link on my social media for everyone to buy the book. So anyone who follows me on social media, I was like, this book is for you. So it's a broad audience, but truly as many people as possible, because it is so accessible, full of historical information and wisdom, but just really practical for anyone who's curious about this topic or feels challenged by it. Honestly, it's a great way for someone who wrestles with the topic to wrestle with the book and interpret the scripture and the history for themselves.
Yeah, just piggybacking off of that, I don't think it'd be helpful just to name a bunch of names right now, although I can think of a lot of them. But really, I have a heart for, students, and so I just think of a lot of colleges, a lot of Christian colleges, and I would love to see this as a required textbook in an introduction to the New Testament, simply because there's so much misinformation out there, things that all of us took for granted maybe when we were younger, and we realized they were half-truths or not true. And even the fact that we're all still learning about these subjects and having to disabuse ourselves of misinformation about the real lives of women in the ancient world and early Christianity. I think education, requirements, because I think we could all use some of these updates to make sure that we're keeping track with what our real knowledge of history is.
Yes, and I know probably the audience knows, Susan, that you have a more dense book with Oxford University Press on the topic. For anybody who gets excited by this book and then wants to go deeper, they should know about that. So I know that one's aimed, at a certain audience, but I would say even those folks who read that book, like me, would benefit from this book. And so for me, clergy might read this book and then want to go deeper into the other one, but I still think this is the way to go, because you can more quickly get a handle on the topics or themes. And so actually, I don't think they're for two different audiences in that way. I'm Baptist, and we have something called Baptist Women in Ministry, and I really want and will alert the leadership of Baptist Women in Ministry nationally, because I am in a tradition that is still having conversations about this. So as my role as Baptist House Director, everything related to that. And the last thing I would say, there's a big conference that happens every year, I hope everybody knows about, called Nevertheless She Preached. And this would be a really great book to have on the table of resources for people to purchase. So from a meta, and I'm in a very learned church where people like to do book studies in Sunday school. And this really lends itself to a group Sunday school or Wednesday night, in our case, study. So like Nijay, there's like a lot of things, but those are some ones I would hit.
Yeah. If I could also answer that question too. Thank you all for your responses. To me, the sweet spot of this book is the person who, they live in the culture that we all live in, where women are doing all kinds of amazing things, right? But they get to church and they're like, oh, but the Bible says women can't do that. And so there's an openness to exploring new things, but there's also this importance that the Bible plays in their lives, right? And they want to be faithful to what Scripture says. And I think that's important. And so I hope that this book would offer them new resources to see that they can be faithful interpreters of scripture and also embrace women's ministry.
Well, thank you so much. We also have some questions from our audience. One of the ones that just recently came in was, how do those who are maybe currently in seminary or who are learning this themselves, where is their role in the conversation? Like, if they're still in the process of figuring it out and they really want to push for their seminary or their church or something to make this, what's the best way for them to go about introducing this conversation? Especially, like you all said, it can be especially for those of us in the Baptist tradition and certain other faith traditions, it can be a hot button issue. So what's the best way to bring this up?
I don't know. I'm thinking Jamie has a lot of experience with this. But I guess I'll just offer that, I think when people are really resistant, I don't expect to get very far, right? It's not like I think they're going to sit down and read this book and change their minds. But there are often ways that by being informed, we can insert little, questions into a conversation or remind people about the kinds of things that women are doing in the New Testament and, questions that we have about how that might work. So for me, I think just being prepared to take those opportunities when they arise might be one way.
So maybe make it an organic sort of conversation, like when it comes up and when there's an opportunity that's sort of ripe for the picking. Any, Dr. Clark Soles?
Since Susan called on me, what I see my students do, which inspires me and makes me just love them even more, if that's possible, is, you can start your own, as students, you can also start your own discussion group and invite your peers and just say, hey, who wants to agree to read this book together? And I just think coming together with any time you want to come together, it doesn't have to last for 10 years. It can be like a brief amount of time. We all agree to consider this topic. And then you have somebody else to think with in your local context about how you can actually spread interest beyond your group to the larger community.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things to that. Where I teach at Northern Seminary, we get people from different backgrounds, and I think one thing we have in our favor, those of us teaching a subject, is our students will they will kind of take on our passions, and hopefully there's some trust there if they've come to study with you, or if they've had a class with you. And I think, especially if we've published on this or there's a book that you have on it, I think if you approach the subject saying, hey, this is such an important topic, let's sit down, have a conversation, we're going to try to not be judgmental. I think I have rules for the classroom that I put up about respect, integrity, giving care to one another. I think setting those parameters and saying, like, ask the hard questions. Let's not shame people, but let's have a conversation about this. I think setting the parameters for the discussion like that can really open things up. And then I've noticed with books in particular, it's less confrontational because you're talking about a third thing. I'm not talking about me. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about this book. And I've noticed when it's a book, people can feel more free to be critical one way or another because you've made it an object rather than a subject. Eventually, you do want to make it relate to your life, but this takes the threat level down a little bit.
All right. One of our listeners, Arlene, asks, where is the archaeological records that correct that assumption that women were property? Obviously, this was a time where there were people that were being owned and bought and sold. And so what's the evidence that we have that this wasn't a gender assignment, that if you're a woman, you are property of a man? Where would someone go if they wanted to find that evidence?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, not all of the evidence is archaeological, I should say. A lot of it is literary evidence, and most of that is stuff that's been around for years. And as Evie mentioned, some people were property, right? We certainly have enslaved women as well as enslaved men who were the property of people. It's just would be wrong to say that everyone was. So when I am making that argument, I'm looking primarily at legal documents, which we have some of, mostly from the Roman world, that specify that that both sons and daughters are under the authority of the legal authority of their father while he's alive, but when he dies, they become legally independent, right? So the same apply that same it's not ownership, right? But that same authority applies to both men and women, and then it goes away when their father dies. And because of that, they could also at that point become property owners. When their father gave them an inheritance, it belonged to them. So that was part of Roman practice. And it's in part because of that model that I see in places where we don't necessarily know what the exact legal structure was. But if we see women owning their own property, it suggests to me that there's something similar going on, right? There's some kind of legal independence, so that if I'm a woman in Egypt, I can, register my camels for tax purposes, right? And I'm doing that in the same way that a male person owner would do it, suggests a kind of ability to operate under the law. So sometimes we have to look at the individual circumstances and sort of tease out from the evidence that we have what the likely social structure was. And in some cases, we have actual legal records.
I'll make a couple recommendations for those listeners who are interested. Be on the lookout for source books. So probably Susan's work has those listed. Definitely her Oxford book does. And my book has some of those listed. I think it's like Women in the Classical World, something like that. There's a few of these out there. Unfortunately for lay people, a lot of this information is hard to find if you're just looking for a specific inscription or a specific papyrus. But if you go to a source book, it actually has tons of this information collated into one place, which is really huge. So a kind of lower shelf recommendation is go to Susan's footnotes in her Oxford book, Women in the New Testament World, and you'll find the source book information there. That has all the goodness, all the good stuff in it.
Awesome. And then this would be, I think, a great question for all of you, because you all write on this topic and things like that. How do you develop this imagination? I think for some people, they see looking at facts and having imagination as separate things. And so how do you cultivate your capacity for imagination so that when you look at these facts, you put them together in new or interesting ways? Do you guys have a process, or do you have inspiration that you use?
I love that question. I guess I would say, part of what I do in the book by asking you to write down, what are the words that suggest women are doing this or something, is just that attention to the text itself and seeing what's there. Because I think that whether we're reading, something about women or just a biblical text that we've often read before, it's sometimes hard to even notice the things that are really there because we have these assumptions already about what it says, because we've heard it before, right? And we know what Jesus is like, and we expect what he should do or not do, right? And so, then when we see in Luke Jesus saying you should hate your mother and father, we sometimes don't even notice that it says that because we don't think that Jesus would ever encourage us to hate someone, right? But it does say that. And so somehow this reading, rereading, close reading of the biblical text itself, I think can be one of the best resources to developing your imagination, just to see something new.
It sounded like some. Oh yeah, go ahead, Dr. Clark.
Yeah, I think it is a fantastic question. I actually listed in my course goals for my class one of the 7 things the course aims to do, and that is to cultivate imagination. And we do that in a variety of ways, as Susan has so brilliantly done here, with even imagining and giving us a family to follow with names, etc. I mean, she obviously admits, it's speculative. Okay, fine. But human beings are made for stories. That's the things that stick to us, the things that influence us the most. So actually doing these imaginative practices and sharing them in a group, I think. The other practical things I do in my class is I have students read poetry. I mean, not about the New Testament, just good poetry. As well as short stories. Again, not related to the New Testament, just actual good short stories. Alice Walker's The Welcome Table when we read the Gospel of Luke. So just to get them thinking about the power of texts. And, what do you notice in this very little short story? What makes it powerful? Why do the characters come alive? Now, what if you asked those same questions about the Bible? Because I think, like Nijay might have said earlier, people come to the Bible very constrained in a lot of ways. I try to help them think of the Bible as a playground, I say, instead of a prison, because there's all these like, oh no, it's this holy thing and I can't touch it and I can't have any imagination. Imagination is like a sacrilegious, treating it like it's just any other short story. So if you can get people to free up and grease the wheels with beautiful literature where individual words really matter, and then once they're freed up and loose, just say, as a thought experiment, I'm not talking to your bishop about what you said or your DS, just as a thought experiment, what would happen if we did the same thing with this text? So basically the kinds of things Susan's doing, but I also add in poetry and short stories unrelated to the Bible to get people loosened up for things that aren't scriptural.
I love that.
That's great. Yeah, Reverend Rogers.
So not in academia, but just in my church context, in my congregation, I regularly lead different small group Bible studies. And something that I found very helpful to do that, you have both already talked about is just the practice of Lectio Divina, that it forces my group members to slow down and stop assuming they know what the passage says because they've read it a bunch at whatever speed they might read their normal quiet times, or they've heard the same sermon about it over and over and over. Incorporating Lectio Divina into my small groups has been a real blessing for all of us, myself included, because you stop presuming you know what the text is saying, and it allows you, part of it is the imagination. What comes to your mind? What do you picture? What stands out to you? What could this mean? And so Lectio Divina has been very helpful for me in a practical ministry setting to help my parishioners imagine themselves in the text, imagine the world of the text, and what God could be saying through that.
I love that, Elizabeth. I want to piggyback on something Jamie said. Talking about poetry and art. For me, one thing that really helps is actually looking at ancient visual art, because it breaks you out of the modern ways that we think about art. So, for example, I loved showing students art from Pompeii and Herculaneum, mostly Pompeii, because we have a ton of art from Pompeii, and women are featured in a lot of the art. You have statues of women like Eumakia, and you have graffiti that mention a lot of women in positive or negative ways. And one of the amazing things is we have color art, which is really rare. And catacombs sometimes give us some color art. I think just seeing that art makes us think about their clothing, hairstyles, jewelry, postures. In my book, Tell Her Story, I was only allowed to put in a couple pictures. And actually, Susan and I have the same picture, one of them, which is the woman at the marketplace. This idea of a woman doing business, being an entrepreneur, having to deal with the bustling marketplace. It just feeds the imagination. I love visual art. I love poetry, but I think I love visual art a little bit more.
Well, it's poetry that's actually 3D, right?
Yeah, totally.
So here's another great question. And this one I think is really a challenge for those of us that are in the academic setting where we tend to be segregated from our Old Testament colleagues. Is somebody asked about what's the overlap or the similarities between understanding how women operated, were thought of in our Old Testament setting versus our New Testament setting? And would there have been any precedent given the writings of the Old Testament, even for people in the New Testament, to have seen women doing these things as still being very faithful and appropriate and culturally within a norm?
I think this is a wonderful question. And I would caveat the whole thing by saying I'm not a scholar of the Old Testament. Like, I don't know what the culture was like. It took me a long time to study the New Testament culture, right? So it's not really fair. But what the work has made me do is to want to ask more questions about the story that I've heard about the Old Testament, just like I'm asking questions about the story about the New Testament. Because I do see all kinds of things in there that make me wonder if what I've been told about women was really true or not. Like in the story of Ruth, Ruth and Naomi go back to Naomi's village, in part because her husband had land there. And it seems to me that it's going to become Naomi's property. And that Ruth is, sort of getting wrapped into this inheritance, the practices that already existed in the time. But it does not seem to me that they are completely without resources, even though they're widowed women. Or, of course, the awesome end of Proverbs, often, the woman of valor or whatever, however we would talk about her. There's one verse that says she sees a field and takes it. Maybe buys it is the way it usually gets translated. But it is that straightforward, right? And so we have these women who are supposedly habitually and also as a virtue, really active, and buying and selling is included in that. So it makes me just want to ask more questions.
Mm-hmm. I wonder too, that our New Testament is written by Jewish authors, and even though they're living in the Roman world, are those stories from their Hebrew Bible still setting up some of these expectations for? We have the Septuagint. We know that they're reading the Bible even in Greek, even when they're in Roman times. So I think that's interesting that those two cultures might be coming together, which your book already showed. People have a lot of different allegiances and have a lot of, different virtues that they're being asked to embody at the same time. So that's really, really interesting. Thank you. We have one. Oh, go ahead, please, Dr. Clark.
No, that's okay. I don't want to take it. I was just going to say the part of the reason. So my book on women in the Bible, I was invited to do it, so I didn't have a choice in a way. Like, in other words, I had to do the whole Bible, which is why, as Susan said, I'm a New Testament scholar. And so it took me a really, really, really lot of years, mostly because I had to go. But I think it is a great question. And having spent time doing that, there are definitely serious connections between. So you have female prophets who are very powerful, right? Even as we know, Mary's Magnificat that Susan brings in is built on Hannah's song. But you have women business owners, like you just said, the woman in Proverbs 31, she's an actual business owner. Even the whole business about God as a nursing mother, right? The whole notion that mothers imparted virtue, even through breast milk, by the way, that comes, you see that imagery of women. It's all related to the moral upbringing of the children, etc. So there's a ton. It's a great question, and there's a ton of stuff. The assumptions we have that are just like women were nothing, basically, in the New Testament, people have that times 10, I think, when it comes to the Old Testament. And so I love that there are resources out there available now to do the same thing Susan's trying to do, to say, whoa, not so fast. It's not, you can't just draw this huge generalization. There were all kinds of women doing all kinds of things. So let's get down to the granular level and speak in a more nuanced, accurate fashion. But it is a great question. Yeah.
I'll chime in real quick too. One thing I learned from Susan from her previous work is kind of some of the competing interests that Rome had. So on the one hand, they're really interested in power and stratification, which is a very vertical thing, but they're also interested in expansion, which can be a very leveling thing, because if you're good at what you do, and that's good for Rome, then they'll let you do whatever you want, essentially. And so you look at the women of Romans 16. How can you have so many women in this text traveling, doing ministry, independent, some of them wealthy? I think Rome has opened up some of these possibilities that weren't possible in the Greek world before that, or in some of the ancient Mediterranean cultures. I think their own desire for more kind of opened up maybe even some loopholes that women took appropriate advantage of. So I'm always curious when the fullness of time that we talk about of the New Testament, could it be some of these roads that Rome allowed for, for women to travel and to operate independently?
Oh, wow, that's a great thought. Yeah, and how pluralistic the Romans were, that everything was to a certain extent welcome, like you said, as long as it plays according to their rules. And isn't that fascinating that something as subversive as what we find in the Gospel and the New Testament is coming via all of these other roads? I think that right there is already so fascinating. Does anyone have any last comments that they would like to make, or something that came up in our discussion today that you just really, really want to go back to and say, all right, real quick, I just want to say this before we finish up. I want to give the last couple minutes to you.
Okay, I do have a burning question, and maybe it can't be answerable, but I'd love if we could talk about it. So I've been preaching on Mary of Nazareth the last few weeks, and someone asked me, like, how normal is it for women to be standing in front of a Roman cross? Like, is it a dangerous place? Are they freely allowed to be there? I mean, we can ask the question about the tomb as well. Are they just traversing these spaces comfortably? I would think there's a lot of Roman soldiers around. Women are not safe in many environments. Is it risky for these women, while the men are hiding, to show up in kind of a police environment of men? Do we have any sense of how common this is, how safe it is? These women are clearly bold, but just how normal is this? Does anyone have any comments on that?
It's a great question. I definitely think that's something I haven't ever thought of before. The questions I would also ask are, were they just viewed as like family members? Like, if you can be a family member who supports someone in prison today, it doesn't mean that you are also a criminal, right? So was it that sort of a scenario where even you could admit Jesus was a criminal if you thought so, and it wouldn't necessarily reflect badly on those who were still, showing their love for him? Or was it, as you say, the case that, even looking like an affiliate of his would have been a bad idea? I don't know the answer to that, but it's worth thinking about.
Jamie, any thoughts on that?
I don't have particular thoughts on it beyond the fact that the feeling, if we were going to imagine the way Susan does, the feeling feels very scary. I think just, again, because you're going to be in a mostly male, the people in power who have the weapons.
Although it's also, they crucified people so that everybody would see it happen, right? Yeah. So it's not exactly cordoned off from regular life. And I imagine it being very much in a visible location. Maybe people are walking by as a normal part of, their routine, so that, Rome could say, see what we do when you act in this way. So maybe there's also that sense in which it was just part of daily life. I just don't think we know. Jamie?
So my burning question that we probably don't have time for, I was just like, I want to know is, you start out with the whole thing about Phoebe being a deacon. You always refer to diakonos, right? You talk about it being deacon or servant. I was so curious why you didn't lead out with the option of Phoebe as a minister. Mm-hmm. Why you didn't put minister right from the very beginning, given what you said at the end about the concern about women's authority in the modern church. What made you not? Because I always try to make the point that diakonos is the same thing. Apollos is called, Paul. Whenever the word minister appears in the New RSV, the word is diakonos, which is the same word for Phoebe. So you could just as easily call her a minister, which in English, I think, tends to have more authority than deacon, certainly than servant. So I was just curious about that choice not to call her a minister.
Yeah, that's lovely. I probably should have, now that you say that. I think the main point is that we're not very consistent about it, like you say, right? If a male follower is called a minister and a female is called maybe a deacon, but maybe just a servant, which is like, that could mean anything, then we see our own value system that's being overlaid on the language there, right? I mean, I picked deacon in part because it's still an ordained role in a lot of different religious traditions, right? And so to even make a claim that women were ordained in some sense, if although we don't know how they got into these positions, but that they held these formal titles is important. And Paul uses that title along with Bishop, even the undisputed Paul at some point to talk about the kinds of roles that people had, right? So if women were regularly playing those roles, I think that's really important. But you're right that minister might have been a more useful term into the modern world.
Interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for answering it.
Well, and thank you for bringing that up, Dr. Clark Soles, because that is the perfect question, I think, to end on. Maybe that's how we found Phoebe, as this minister of the gospel. Thank you all so much for being here, for having such a lovely conversation. And not just our panelists, but you, our audience. If you liked what you heard today and you want to know more, you are in luck, because Susan is going to be leading a course on this topic for the Candler Foundry. And if you were here today, you will see a QR code for 50% off of your registering for this course. So we would love to see you in that. I'm sure the conversation will continue on in lots of interesting ways. So thank you so much for being here, and we will see you all at our next webinar.